It took an entire year for it to arrive, but it finally came. Today, I'm going to take a look at the Analogue Pocket. I'll not only give you my impressions on the device as a portable FPGA-based gaming system, but I couldn't help but to tear it down and take a peek inside. This portable FPGA-based gaming system has a lot of promise that it tries to live up to. And it was a long time coming, literally. I ordered my Analogue Pocket on September 1st, 2022, and I finally got my shipping notification on August 22nd, 2023. Yes, it took exactly 1 year from the time that I handed Analogue my money before I had my Pocket in hand. Look, I know a lot of people are upset about some of Analogue's business practices, and I totally get it. There seems to be a lot of scarcity in their product line. And we've been seeing some of their products appearing on online auction sites for double the retail price. But today, I want to set aside those discussions and take a look purely at the tech. I'm going to start out by giving you an overview of the Pocket along with my initial impressions. Then we're going to open it up and take a look at its internals. After that, I'll take you through the software side of things, and I'll show you how to get it set up with cores and ROMs. And then I'm going to put it up against a couple of other gaming options and close out this video with some final thoughts and recommendations. I have to start off by saying that the Analogue Pocket is a beautiful piece of technology, at least from the outside. The casing is made from molded ABS plastic with a semi-textured finish that does feel really nice to the touch. I've heard some people complaining about the quality of the plastic, but I honestly don't agree. It feels high quality to me and is quite sturdy. It also has a good bit of heft to it. When you combine the weight, the semi-textured feel, and the size of the device, it really does feel like a high-end product. And that's something else that I just don't agree with some of the other reviewers about. I've seen a few people say that this device is uncomfortable to hold and play for long periods of time, but I've just found that not to be true at all. Especially when you compare it to the Unhinged GameBoy Advance SP that I did a couple of months ago, which really was uncomfortable for me to play for more than 30 minutes. The Analogue Pocket just feels really good. The rubber dome buttons feel good too. They have a great amount of travel and play. I actually think they feel better than the buttons on the original Game Boy devices. Even the shoulder buttons feel decent, and they're just tack switches. But we'll take a look at how those work in a few minutes when we take this thing apart. The other thing that we need to talk about with this device is its amazing screen. I've done many screen upgrades on my other portable devices, but nothing comes close to this display. This gorgeous screen is 3.5 inches diagonally with a 10:9 aspect ratio, which is the same as the original Game Boy. At the end of the day, the Analogue Pocket is a perfect 10x scaling of the standard Game Boy display. And inside this 3.5 inch screen, they've packed a whopping 1600 by 1440 pixels. That gives this device a pixel density of over 600 pixels per inch. This is just crazy. The highest end laptop and smartphone displays come nowhere close to this resolution. And when you play Game Boy games on this device, you really appreciate the quality of this screen and the care that they put into replicating that classic Game Boy experience. Okay, enough of the outside. Let's open it up and see what's on the inside. The back shell here is held in place with 4 T6 screws. Once you get the back cover off, you'll notice that there's a JTAG header here at the bottom. Now, in case you're not familiar with it, a JTAG header can give you insight into what's happening inside the chips. It's often used for debugging, but it can also be used to program a chip's internal flash. In this case, if you're developing a core for the Pocket, you can connect your computer to the JTAG header to test and debug your core as it's running. The battery is contained inside this black housing and held in place with clips, and it looks fairly easy to change if you ever need to replace it. Now, getting a closer look, you can see that the battery is 4,300 milliamp hours, which is quite large, and this is because FPGAs aren't exactly optimized for power efficiency. Now let's take a look at the shoulder buttons. They live on a small PCB that's clipped into place, so I just gently unclipped it and worked it out. And you'll notice a small ribbon cable connecting the shoulder buttons to the mainboard. I think it feels pretty good for tack switches, but if you wanted to swap these out for switches that have more or less force, it looks like it would be a fairly simple operation. I do like how this piece is replaceable. I've had a few different devices where tack switches have gotten damaged over time. To get to the mainboard, we need to remove this plastic cover. This is also held into place with clips, so a little bit of gentle prying should pop it right out. Okay, here's the backside of the mainboard. At the top here, you'll notice two speakers, and it looks like they're attached to the board, each with ribbon cables instead of wires. So we need to disconnect both of those. This ribbon cable here connects the power and volume buttons. And the mainboard should just lift right up. But we do need to be careful because the LCD is attached to the front of the PCB. And wow, there's a lot packed on to the front side of this board. Honestly, I wasn't expecting it to be this densely populated. The fact that they were able to fit all of this onto a PCB this small really demonstrates the amount of engineering that had to go into this device. Now, one of the main things you'll notice is that there's not one, but two FPGAs. The big one up top here is a Cyclone 5, which should sound familiar if you've watched some of my videos on the MiSTer, because it's the same family of FPGAs used by the DE10 Nano. It does differ from the MiSTer's FPGA in some very important ways, however, which we'll take a look at in just a few minutes. And this other FPGA down here is a Cyclone 10. Now, the way this works is Analogue is using the Cyclone 10 for core system functionality, while the Cyclone 5 is used for actually running the FPGA cores. Another thing that really stands out here, and honestly really baffled me at first, is the inclusion of a PIC32 MX4 series microcontroller. So my first reaction was, why in the world are they including a microcontroller on this device when there's a Cyclone 5 on board? Well, to understand this, we need to take a closer look at the two FPGAs that are in this device. As I said earlier, there's two FPGA chips, a Cyclone 5 and a Cyclone 10. But the Cyclone 5 is a different variant than what you'll find in the MiSTer. The MiSTer project uses an S-series chip, which is an SoC with an ARM processor. Because there's an ARM chip on board, the MiSTer's operating system runs directly on that chip. But the Analogue Pocket uses an E-series Cyclone 5. And this chip does not have a processor side. It's just an FPGA. So the PIC32 is used for running the Pocket's operating system. And you can see that from this system architecture diagram that I found on Analogue's site. The Aristotle FPGA is referring to the Cyclone 10, and the system MCU over here is referring to the PIC32. Okay, so the Cyclone 5 is used for running the cores, and is available for developers to build custom cores on top of. And it's the A4 variant, which means that it has 49,000 logic elements. The Cyclone 10, however, is the 10CL016 variant, which only has 16,000 logic elements. So when you compare the two FPGAs, the one used for running cores is much more capable. And I can understand why Analogue did this. The Cyclone 5E chip retails for around $70, but the Cyclone 10 can be picked up for a meager $18. So if a secondary FPGA is needed for core system functionality, there's no need to make it a beefy chip. That would just increase the cost of the overall system. Now, one thing that I'm not too keen on is that Analogue is using the two FPGAs as a marketing point on this device. So someone just kind of casually observing it might think, oh, there's two FPGAs inside of here, so that's gotta be way better than just having one. And Analogue goes as far as to tout this in their developer documentation, listing each FPGA and even pointing out that there's 15,000 logic elements in the Cyclone 10. This gives the impression that developers can use that Cyclone 10 chip, but Analogue says that it's not user accessible. At the heart of the Analogue Pocket software is something that Analogue calls the Analogue OS. Now, there's not a lot of information available, but it seems that Analogue is planning to standardize the usage of this operating system across its products. The Analogue OS has several cores built in, which will play physical games that you insert into the cartridge slot. Out of the box, it supports Game Boy and Game Boy Advance cartridges. But Analogue also sells cartridge adapters that you can use to insert Sega Game Gear, Atari Lynx, Neo Geo Pocket, and TurboGrafx-16 cartridges. The Game Gear adapter is available now, but the others are only listed for pre-order. Analogue did optimize this system for a cartridge-first experience, and it really shows. It feels magical when you insert a real Game Boy cartridge and the high-density display lights up with a nostalgic feel. And they did an amazing job emulating the experience of different Game Boy displays. You can change the screen settings to imitate a Game Boy Pocket and even a Game Boy Light. And it's pretty crazy how authentic these screen modes actually feel. While the built-in cartridge-based experience is fantastic, you could argue that it's not worth the $220 price tag, especially when you can get an okay experience with a Game Boy Advance SP and a decent $50 screen upgrade. Looking at them side by side though, there's no doubt that the Analogue Pocket does the Game Boy experience better than the original devices. And when you factor in features such as low power sleep mode and saved states for cartridges, even if you just want to play your classic Game Boy cartridges, it's starting to look like a pretty good investment. But Analogue does take it a step further with an initiative that it calls Open-FPGA. This probably wasn't the best name for them to use, because there's an existing initiative online already called Open-FPGA. So if you go searching, you're going to stumble across it and think that this is some larger initiative that Analogue is participating in. But it's not. This is something different. The Open-FPGA initiative that was started by Analogue is their attempt to establish a standard that can be used for reusable FPGA cores. Even though these cores are only usable on the Pocket right now, I would assume that Analogue's other products could also leverage these Open-FPGA cores in the future. If you're a developer and want to create Open-FPGA cores, Analogue provides some decent documentation and a set of starter templates that you can use. Because Open-FPGA cores can be created by anyone, there's not a single repository that houses them all. So you may have to hunt around a bit to find the ones that you really want. One person, however, did put together a site that inventories several known Open-FPGA cores into a single location. Now, I don't know if it's exhaustive, but there's currently 106 cores listed on that site. Once you've found the cores you want, installing them is super simple. First, you need to download the core. Then insert your micro SD card into your computer. And then just copy the contents of the zip file onto the root of the micro SD card. When you insert the card back into the Pocket, the core will be listed under the Open FPGA menu. Now, if you don't want to have to go out and find and manually load up all the cores that you want, you can use one of the community tools to load them all for you. Now, there's a few different tools out there, but there's two in particular that I've used, and so let's take a look at both of those. The first one is called Pocket Updater, and you can download that from the following GitHub repository. Pocket Updater does a good job giving you a one-click experience to get all your cores loaded up. And in addition to installing the cores, Pocket Updater lets you organize them into different categories, so you don't have to go scrolling through the whole list when you want to play them. And another nice feature of Pocket Updater is its integration of asset image packs. These provide various pieces of artwork for OpenFPGA cores when you select them in the menu screen. The other community tool that I've used is called Pocket Sync. Unlike Pocket Updater, Pocket Sync is multi-platform, so you can run it on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Pocket Sync has a very polished look and also has a couple of features that Pocket Updater doesn't have. For one thing, Pocket Sync has the ability to browse and manage the saved states for your games. Now, there's not a lot that you can do here, but it's useful to be able to see them and have the option of deleting them if you need to free up some storage. Pocket Sync also gives you a game loader view that lists each core and the number of games that you have for that core. And if you click on one of the tiles, it opens up directly to the folder that you need to drag and drop your ROM files into, which is very helpful in loading them up. But there's one other killer feature of Pocket Sync that's worth calling out. You can synchronize your cartridge level saves between the Analogue Pocket and the Mister. Yeah, this is very cool. This means that you can play a game on the Pocket and then transfer the saved game over to the Mister to continue playing it on the big screen. Now, it's important to note that this only works with the native save functionality that the games have built in. You can't do this with the saved states feature in the Pocket, but it's still very cool. Okay, once you have your cores installed, the next thing to do is to load up your ROM files. For this, you'll want to use the Assets folder. Each system has a dedicated folder under Assets, and within that folder is another folder called Common. The Common folder is where you want to copy your ROM files into, because it's the default location that the cores use to find those files. Now, if you happen to have two different cores installed for the same system, you'll see a number on the right side of the core list. So here, for example, I have two different NES cores installed. I can select the Change Core option and switch between them. But regardless of which cores are installed, they'll look to that Common folder for the ROMs. So you only need to have one copy of your ROMs on the card. So far, I've spent a decent amount of time playing about a dozen different handheld and console cores, as well as a few different arcade cores. And as far as I can tell, they all perform as you'd expect them to. In particular, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color cores feel the best out of all of them, and it's no surprise. The device is very Game Boy-like, so after a while, you forget that you're playing with hardware emulation. I think a large part of this is that these games fill the entire screen, and that makes the experience much more immersive. Now, I traveled to Europe for a business trip last week, and during the flight, I played Game Boy games on the Analogue Pocket for hours. Other cores play great as well, but they don't all offer the same feature set. For example, the SNES core feels really accurate, but it lacks the ability to save state. And according to the GitHub repo, there aren't any plans to add this feature either. But I'd prefer to use a core that supports save states over one that doesn't. Next, I want to compare the Analogue Pocket to a couple of other devices. The first one that I want to put it up against is none other than the Mister. Now, this really isn't a fair comparison. The Mister and the Analogue Pocket are two different devices for two different scenarios. And really, the only thing they have in common is that they're both FPGA-based game systems. But many FPGA enthusiasts are looking at one of these two systems to purchase, so there's still value in comparing them. First and foremost, of course, is the form factor of these systems. The Mister is intended to be powered externally and plugged into an external monitor with external inputs. And the Analogue Pocket is intended to run from a battery with its built-in display and built-in inputs. And this is perhaps the most obvious difference between the two. And this also has a bunch of implications. For one thing, an FPGA that's optimized to run on battery isn't going to be as versatile as an FPGA that isn't optimized for power efficiency. And when you compare the Mister's Cyclone 5 S-Series FPGA to the Pocket's Cyclone 5 E-Series FPGA, you can see the difference. As I mentioned earlier, the Mister's FPGA is an SoC with an ARM processor embedded. And the FPGA side has 110,000 logic elements. The Pocket's FPGA, however, is just an FPGA, and it only contains 49,000 logic elements. And this makes a big difference when it comes to the types of systems that it can emulate. Because of this, many 5th generation consoles such as the PlayStation and Sega Saturn won't be possible on the Analogue Pocket, though they work great on the Mister. Another notable difference between the Mister and the Analogue Pocket is the input processing. On the Analogue Pocket, controller input uses a polling mechanism. As I've discussed in some of my previous videos on controller input latency, polling will always carry a risk of input lag. The Mister, on the other hand, has a direct input mechanism through the snack interface, which isn't polling based. This doesn't mean that the Pocket's controls are poor and laggy though. They're not. I've been using my Pocket quite a bit, and there hasn't yet been a situation where I felt like the Analogue Pocket's controls had lagged behind. It is worthwhile noting, however, that the Mister does offer some better input options. I'd also be remiss to not call out that the Mister's operating system is open source, while the Analogue OS isn't. Because of this, we get pretty regular updates to the Mister to address bug fixes and feature enhancements from the community. The Analogue OS, however, hasn't really seen an update for about 5 months now. The last major difference that I want to call out here is price. The Analogue Pocket is retailing for $220, and that gets you a fully playable system. The Mister, however, will cost you somewhere around $400 for just a basic setup, and that doesn't include any controllers or a display. And you can easily spend more with the Mister by purchasing accessories, snack adapters, and other add-ons. All that said, if you want an Analogue Pocket, you're probably going to have to wait for a while. Analogue seems to be perpetually out of stock on all their units, and as I mentioned earlier, my order took a full year to arrive. The Mister's DE10 Nano board is also sometimes difficult to find, but back orders get fulfilled in weeks, not years. And at the time that I'm filming this video, Mouser has hundreds available for sale right now. Okay, so that's the lay of the land when comparing the Analogue Pocket to the Mister. But what about the scenario where you're comparing it to another handheld gaming system? In particular, I want to put it up against the GameBoy Advance SP Unhinged. Now, I built one of these devices a couple of months ago using Boxy Pixel's aluminum kit, and really loved the device. But is the Analogue Pocket a better option? Before jumping into that discussion, we first need to get one thing out of the way. The GBA SP Unhinged will only natively play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. As I mentioned earlier, these systems are all supported on the Analogue Pocket as well, But the Pocket also supports other systems out of the box that the Game Boy Advance doesn't. So if you're looking for more than just Game Boy games, then the Analogue Pocket is the clear winner there. But let's just set that aside for a minute and talk specifically about the Game Boy gaming aspect. Now, the Unhinged does have a nice size screen with a clear IPS display that's a step up from the native Game Boy Advance SP screen. When you put it side by side with the Analogue Pocket's display, it actually looks pretty similar, even though the Analogue Pocket has a much higher resolution. But you can see a big difference when you play original Game Boy cartridges. The game fills the entire display on the Pocket, while it feels like the size of a postage stamp on the Unhinged. In terms of form factor, the Unhinged is a bit smaller and more portable than the Pocket. You may struggle to fit the Analogue Pocket into your actual pocket, but I don't think you'll have that challenge with the Unhinged. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you use a Game Boy cartridge inside the GBA SP Unhinged, a significant portion will stick out from the bottom, and that makes the overall unit bigger and more difficult to hold while you're playing it. And speaking of comfort, something that I brought up in my review of the Unhinged is how I could really only hold it comfortably for about 30 minutes while playing it. Now, this was because of the weight combined with the sharp edges of the aluminum case pressing into my skin. I don't have this problem with the Analogue Pocket. Even though the device is bigger, it doesn't feel any heavier, and it's quite comfortable to hold for many hours. And believe it or not, the price of both of these units is about the same. The Unhinged GBA costs $209 for all the parts. And if you don't already own a Game Boy Advance SP that you can modify, then the Analogue Pocket will actually be cheaper. So while I really do love the Game Boy Advance SP Unhinged, the Analogue Pocket is a better value for the money, and it provides a better experience if you're just looking for a good portable device to play classic Game Boy games on. The Analogue Pocket has a lot going for it, and I don't regret the purchase decision at all. And to be honest, in the past month or so since I've had it, I've actually been playing it a lot more than I've been playing my Mister. Now, some of this is because I've been traveling and have been able to take it with me. But even if I wasn't, it's just convenient to pick it up and play it. Or to spend a few minutes playing it in bed at night before I fall asleep. In terms of playability, I do disagree with some of the critical reviews I've seen about this device being uncomfortable to hold. As I mentioned earlier, it has been one of the more comfortable portable gaming devices that I own. What I don't love, however, is some of Analogue's business practices around this device. Not just the Pocket, but many of their devices and accessories seem to be always out of stock. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it took a full year from the time I placed the order for my Analogue Pocket until it arrived at my door. There aren't that many products that I would have that much patience waiting for. And to be honest, the only reason why I was able to wait that long for the Pocket was because I forgot that I bought it. But all that said, it's a neat device, and I'm glad it exists. Should you buy one? Well, that's up to you. I will say that if I was just now hearing about the Analogue Pocket for the first time today, I'd still buy one. Well, thanks for taking a look at the Analogue Pocket with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video and perhaps it answered some of your questions on this device. Post any thoughts that you have in the comments below, and also feel free to ask any other questions. I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can. All right, well, that's it for today's episode. Hey, thanks for watching, and until next time, go make something cool.